Hi everyone, my name is Alexander Zalivako, and I'm the founder of From A to Z law firm. One of the areas of our expertise are sanctions, and in a series of presentations called Sanctions 360 Degrees, we will look into major sanctions economic regimes and the way they affect the lives of private individuals and corporations. Thank you very much for watching. Sanctions and the restrictions which they impose for day-to-day life of private individuals and companies became an important part of our life. This prompted me to prepare this series of presentations, which purpose is to give the overview of major sanctions regime, how they function, and what restrictions they entail for individuals and companies. And in this introductory presentation, I would consider the historical perspective of the sanctions programs of today with the purpose to demonstrate that although sanctions are an important part of our everyday life, they are not a new phenomena, and they have been around basically since civilizations emerged. In this introductory presentation, I'll talk about the relevance and objectives which sanctions have traditionally aimed to achieve. I would propose a possible classification just for the purpose of setting the field in a little bit more detail and discuss major sanctions programs, as well as give historical overview so that we can put the events of today into the historical perspective. And it's nice to think about sanctions with the statement of President Wilson, which was made more than 100 years ago, where in essence he proposed that sanctions is an alternative to modern way warfare. So rather than waging wars, President Wilson thought the same objectives can be achieved by a comprehensive sanctions program. And that's a nice way of thinking about sanctions because, first of all, they are purported to be a very powerful tool of coercing a country to change its behavior or embrace a behavior which the sanctioning country wants it to embrace. And second of all, it's an alternative to what was believed to be an acceptable way of achieving the same post-World War I period. And with this statement in mind, we set the following objectives in this presentation and those presentations which will follow, which is to give an overview of the general sanctions regime, to consider the relevance of them for the individuals and companies, to propose and to set the field for what can be used then as an analysis of UN-depth situations, and then hopefully also to have some philosophical opinion on the matter, whether at the end of the day, the sanctions programs, which are multiple, aim to achieve their objectives and aim to serve as an alternative warfare tool without imposing damage on those civilian populations who are not really supposed to be the target of the sanctions. To understand various sanctions programs, it's nice to think about them in contrast, to propose some sort of classification of the sanctions, not for the sake of itself, but for the sake of seeing what may be the difference in different sanctions programs and what they purport to achieve by these different tools and mechanisms. The first way of thinking about sanctions is to contrast multilateral and unilateral sanctions. Multilateral sanctions are those sanctions which are adopted by a body where the will of one or several or multiple member states has to be accorded so that they agree on a specific program. The most important forum for multilateral sanctions would be, of course, the United Nations, where any subject matter has to be approved by the permanent members of the UN Security Council, which means that the various opinions on the matter are taken into account and the consensus has to be found in between those opinions because each member of the UN Security Council has a veto right and by doing so can basically torpedo the relevant measures being implemented. The benefit of multilateral sanction is that, first of all, as representing the political consensus, this seems to be a fair way of addressing a problem. Various views are represented, permanent members have veto rights, necessary majority has to be achieved at the UN Security Council. This in principle shall ensure the balance of powers, various opinions being taken into account in the decision-making process, and accordingly a fair and just decision. Also, as a body representing international community, multilateral sanctions in principle have more chances to achieve their objective because they bind the international community and accordingly ensure the broad, also practical support at the level of implementation. Another example of multilateral sanctions can be the European Union sanction, where the decision-making process requires the unanimity of all member states, which again, given that there is a difference of opinions, ensures that the decision which is taken is more nuanced, more balanced, taking into account various factors, with a caveat that at the end of the day, these categories of sanctions still represent the opinion of one part of the world, and in this case, may be said to be lacking the democratic support of the wider community. The multilateral sanctions obviously have the downside, which is the difficulty of reaching the consensus among those members who have to adopt the sanctions, meaning that they may not be possible to be adopted in the circumstances which require swift and prompt response, or in the circumstances when there is a clear political division between various member states on the matter. So the trade-off is between legitimacy versus efficiency. The unilateral sanctions conversely are adopted by individual member states, and from that perspective, to the extent the relevant decision-making body within the state has political power, can be adopted swiftly with respect to the matter of concern. The disadvantage of unilateral sanctions is that they lack legitimacy of international support, and obviously, as the matter is adopted by single member states, arguably they are less nuanced and they're more rough in their application. Another way to look at the sanctions is to look at the type of restrictions the economic sanctions impose, where at the polar end will be embargo type of sanctions, which in essence cut any kind of economic relationships between the countries, subject to a limited number of exceptions, primarily related to trade in humanitarian goods or medical goods, versus targeted sanctions, which purport to be more nuanced and which target specific individuals or specific type of transactions or specific type of services. Below an example of a standard embargo wording, which in essence summarizes what I've just mentioned, a complete cut of economic and finance relationship between the countries. The modern trend is towards targeted sanctions on the basis that they are believed to better serve their purpose with limited damage to those parts of the society who are not directly responsible for the behavior which the sanctions purport to correct. There are as many targeted sanctions as one could imagine, but the basic categories are summarized on this slide and would include asset freezes with respect to individuals or corporations involved in the behavior which the sanctions target. In principle, asset freeze would mean that all assets of these individuals or corporations within the jurisdictions imposing the sanctions have to be frozen and not available when the sanctions are in force, and the relationships between the relevant jurisdictions and these individuals would be prohibited, subject to, again, a limited number of exceptions. Arms embargo would be another example of targeted sanctions, which again is quite an uncontroversial measure. Then there is finance and trade restrictions may be imposed. Again, in the ideal world, those finance and trade restrictions should be carefully tailored to address the behavior which we want to correct. And there is a miscellaneous variation of all these type of sanctions one could think and one could imagine. The bottom line of this category is, though, that the relationship between the countries continue, and by doing so, we emphasize the political will to change the behavior of certain individuals within the country rather than the relationships between the countries in their entirety. Another important factor to consider when we talk about sanctions is the purpose which they try to achieve, and I summarize various purposes in the next bullet point. The importance of thinking about the purpose of the sanctions is not just a political matter, but it's also a legal matter, which would be the focus of our presentations. as the purpose is often used as a tool to interpret the sanctions. And whilst one might think that the purpose is always to change the behavior of the state, at the more generic level, this is certainly true, but when we go into the specific prohibitions in place, then the purpose can become more nuanced. And I give here an example of the oil price cap introduced against the Russian trade in crude oil, which sets out two purposes which the countries introducing oil price cap want to achieve. On the one hand, they certainly want to reduce Russian revenues coming from the export of crude. And for that reason, in principle, oil price cap says that oil may be traded only to the extent the oil price cap is respected in the relevant trade transactions. But on the other hand, the second purpose is to avoid any adverse effect which the lack of crude may have on international prices and global markets. And for that reason, the general objective is to make sure that the crude is available, although at a reduced price. This is an example of how the objective can be more nuanced, and it's more relevant to understand. It's important to understand it if we want them to apply the specific provisions of, for example, oil price cap restrictions against Russian crude. We'll finish by a brief historical overview, because it may seem that sanctions is a phenomena of today, that they are something very recent, and they've not been around. And this would not be the way to look at the sanctions, because they've been around as long as civilization was around. And although their nature has changed, in principle, it's a very old tool of international politics. I tried to summarize here the basic periods of use of sanctions and how they evolved historically. One might say that the first period, very broad first period, is the period before the World War I, when economic sanctions were clearly a colorally an additional part of the military action. So they would typically either precede military action or be an auxiliary part of the military action, but the purpose would be ultimately to advance the military objectives of the relevant states imposing the sanctions. And here I give a couple of examples of the most known sanctions being imposed between various parties, where the point is made that they are ultimately just a part of the military action between the states. This long approach of looking at economic sanctions have changed after World War I, in part because of the hardships and sufferings inflicted by that military conflict, and the emergence of the League of Nations, and the general purpose of the League of Nations as promoting international peace, as opposed to national interests of various member states of international community. And the covenant which established the League of Nations mentioned the economic sanctions as one of the tools which would contribute to that common good of international peace. And in essence, Article 16 provided that to extent one of the member states starts a war, this action should lead to the immediate interruption of all economic relations. So in essence, to the comprehensive embargo. The practical implication of these principles within the period between World War I and World War II was more unsuccessful than successful. But the point for us remains important, that that's for the first time when international sanctions have been elevated from merely a tool of national interests to the tool of international politics, which was believed to serve a wider purpose of preserving international peace. The next period would be the period of the Cold War, where at the level of multinational sanctions, the situation was described by a rivalry between the Western Bloc and the Soviet Bloc, which as a practical matter paralyzed any sanctions being introduced at the level of the UN Security Council, where permanent members would be vetoing the propositions of the other camp. And in essence, the only examples of unilateral sanctions one might give over this period of time were the sanctions introduced against Southern Rhodesia and South Africa to address the discrimination of Black majorities in these countries. The period also saw the proliferation of unilateral sanctions, which were used for various reasons. And the point which I would like to make here is that, first of all, the sanctions introduced by national member states become more and more common. And they introduce not just the biggest powers, as one might think of, but also by the countries which are not that much associated with the sanctions. For example, I give the example of India versus Portugal. When the sanctions were introduced to coerce Portugal to leave Goa in India, or Spain, who introduced sanctions to coerce UK to leave Gibraltar. Not the typical examples of countries introducing the sanctions one might think about. But obviously, these are just examples to show that this is a tool commonly used not just with big powers. The most common examples of the sanctions during this period would be the restrictions in trade between the Western Bloc and the Soviet Bloc, with the purpose to prevent advancement in technologies, primarily military technologies. As the time passes, 70s and 80s continued the rivalry between the two blocs. So little was done at the level of international sanctions, with the national sanctions been moving to the areas which became more important in the relevant period. With the current administration, the human rights point and the use of sanctions as a tool to promote human rights became more and more common. With, again, the other examples which became relevant in the 70s and 80s related to nuclear non-proliferation points and the fight against terrorism. With the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, the UN became more important as a forum for the introduction of international economic sanction, meaning that the big powers managed to reach consensus of various matters. And here I give the examples of various situations when the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council agreed that the particular situation would be better resolved by the international community imposing certain economic restrictions over the areas. Nevertheless, and specifically recently, the unilateral sanctions remain certainly an important tool of day-to-day life of individuals and the companies. They have not disappeared from the stage. Conversely, they became more common, especially during the reemergence of the conflicts between major powers, and accordingly, the lack of consensus at the UN level. And it needs to be said that unilateral sanctions continue to be the main tool which we practitioners in our day-to-day life. Thank you very much for watching, and hope to see you during next presentation.